This is about Sweden. The migration minister has said you should feel proud to be a Swedish citizen. You only feel proud once you've made an effort. Immigrants in Sweden must prove they've lived an honest life before being granted citizenship under tighter new rules. They could be required to live in the country for 8 years instead of 5 and show they've not committed any crimes in Sweden or abroad and basically an honest way of life, so no unpaid debts, no criminal record and their conduct since they've arrived. They have to demonstrate also they are financially self-sufficient, so not relying on the state. What a wonderful idea. Well, let's talk about this with Steven Woolfe. He's a former MEP. He's also director of the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity. I mean, Steven, what wild ideas to expect that people coming to live in your country, certainly those coming to get citizenship, should be net contributors, both, you know, not just financially, but also in terms of, you know, culturally and being a good member of society. I mean, wonders will never cease.
Oh, it is. Wonders will definitely never cease. And I thought I'd not see a European country actually start to talk common sense in the way that the Swedish have. And it does look like they have a pretty decent migration minister in John Forsell. He basically got something that we also believe is very much common sense, that citizenship must be earned and is not handed out immediately.
Yeah.
How shocking is that? We'd love the Labour Party to come out and say exactly the same.
I mean, I think one of the most shocking things about, one of the most, no, probably one of the least shocking things about the horrific grooming and rape gangs story that's, you know, it's been around for 20 years and Elon Musk dragged up at New Year again, is that, you know, talking about these dual British-Pakistani nationals, so people not born in this country or people who are born in this country but do have access to another nationality. That, you know, how many of these people, you know, why were all these, you know, kebab shop owners and taxi drivers living in Rochdale and Rotherham and Telford, why were they given British citizenship? What were they contributing? What benefit was there to British people from these men and their families being in this country? And I know, you know, difficult question to ask, and clearly, obviously, you know, Labour and the Lib Dems and Greens will shout racist at me now, but it's a perfectly legitimate question.
It is, and if you listen to those people who sit on the Migrant Advisory Committee, which oddly enough, this is totally a side issue there, they actually published their report from a year ago, only 2 days ago. So that's how much information we get about migration in this country. They would say a taxi driver and a kebab shop owner are net contributors to this country. But
selling a lot of kebabs.
Yeah, well, we'd have to. And I'd say that's very, very different to the story that we're looking at. And when you're looking at Sweden, their proposals are actually, again, I think, incredibly common sense. You have to contribute and have a system of society and values and language, which we all work together, John Forster says, that brings people from disparate countries together under those Swedish values. So you can't be a criminal. We're going to extend your time in Sweden from 5 to 8 years. You've got to be financially sound to be able to stay here. You can't have backing out on your debts. And I think that's perfectly sensible. My interesting point here is whether now with the group of 7 countries that Sweden is now looking at as being to create a stronger immigration policy in the EU, is whether they'll start trying to put this across the EU.
Yeah, I mean, that would be fascinating because, I mean, certainly we are seeing many major countries in the EU sort of moving in that direction, realising the error of their ways. I mean, Denmark was perhaps the country that woke up the first and didn't allow the sort of mass uncontrolled migration, and they do not see some of the same problems some of these other countries have got. Let me also ask you about what is going on back here at home. Kemi Badenoch, the Tory leader, is making her first major speech of 2025. I think there's things going on in the rest of the world that perhaps will rather overshadow that, but apparently she is going to say later this afternoon that, you know, the Tories have made mistakes, particularly over immigration. So, you know, promising to cut immigration, control it, and then actually putting rocket boosters under it. Mistakes over net zero in terms of having a 2050 target and not really having a plan to how to deal with it. I mean, we're going to talk to a guest about that in a few moments, but I would argue you shouldn't have had the target in the first place. But also mistakes over Brexit. So delivering Brexit, but not really having a plan for how we would grow outside the EU. Just tackling the immigration side and the Brexit side, as someone who's a former MEP for the Brexit Party, what do you make of those? We haven't got the full text yet, but what do you make of what we're hearing, of what she's going to say?
Well, I like to see the fact that she's going to apologise deeply. I mean, because it certainly is something that we have noted. You and I both campaigned extensively for ourselves to leave the European Union, to create the opportunities that I still believe are there for us to expand our economy, control migration, reduce regulations, opportunities for our businesses to expand, all of that. And yet it wasn't carried through by the Conservative government. Boris Johnson desperately failed on immigration. He's now actually creates more immigration in this country than Tony Blair, if you look at the statistics. And that's not something that he will have in his political history.
No, I mean, and more than 1 million people net every year coming to this country under Boris Johnson. Yeah. Legally handed visas. Apparently a complete surprise to Number 10 and the Home Office. Utter surprise after they handed out the visas.
Yeah, I'm stunned. That's the same sort of sentiment and statements that Tony Blair has made consistently, that yes, we were told that only 8,000 to 10,000 people would come from the European bloc when we opened it to the AA. Oh, wasn't it shocking that hundreds of thousands came very, very quickly?
It's almost like they weren't warned about it. Oh, they were, of course, by Migration Watch UK, but there we are. But this is the thing. I mean, it's all very well apologising. Do you think anyone will ever trust the Tories again on that?
I think this is where the real problem lies, Suman, is that you have Robert Jenrick now, who is becoming incredibly strong on the issues of deportation of those who are illegal immigrants into the country. He's been really strong on the sexual exploitation gangs, which I think we should have a new investigation into that, a proper investigation into that area. So he's trying to bolster that at the back. The question of whether the public will still believe them after they've seen the big three issues that you talked about failed, and whether her apology is enough, I just don't think it's there at the moment.
No.
And I think Reform would have to make some pretty big mistakes for them to actually allow people who've moved from the Conservatives to Reform to go back again.
Yeah,
this is a long journey.
Certainly not ready there, yeah. And in terms of Brexit, I mean, saying, we should have prepared more for it. But I mean, again, I think everyone does forget, and God, the Ramonas love mentioning this, what's happened to the economy and inflation and things like that. Yeah, small matter of lockdown, by the way. Small matter of lockdown that happened at the same time across the nation and across the world. But also, what do you make of the Liberal Democrat leader, Ed Davey? It's been billed as his first major speech of the year. I'm not entirely sure that the Liberal Democrat leader makes major speeches, but I'm biased. But he says that the UK must rejoin the EU customs union. That's where our future lies. What do you say to that?
Well, I think Ed is actually trying to channel Limahl from the 1980s with Never Ending Story. Perhaps he wants to sing...
What a cultural reference.
Yeah, well, maybe he wants to call it Never Ending Rejoiner, because if you only have to look across the continent, I think the EU is beginning to recognise they're facing an economic apocalypse, which includes stagnation, inflation, weak productivity, weak competitiveness. Only 4 of the top 50 tech companies in the world are from the EU. Yeah. None of the 15 best electric vehicles are from the EU. If he wants us to join that failing organisation and go back, it will only make our nation decline even more quickly.
It is fascinating. He says we should have weaker links with America. I mean, I don't think the man can read a spreadsheet. But actually, I don't think Rachel from Accounts can either. But there we are. Steven Woolfe, great to talk to you as always. Former MEP Director of the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity. Benedict Spence, but I think just come in particularly on the issue of Brexit and customs union and all of that.
It just shows, though, the complete lack of imagination that our political elites actually have, is that they think the answer is to go back and fall in behind the bloc that isn't succeeding. We should have taken the opportunity, we still can, to actually try to get out ahead of these people, to be the ones dragging them forward by competition. Because, yes, we are each other's largest trading partners. Fine, that we're not going to sever all ties, but by setting our own example of what can be achieved outside of the bloc, we can drag the rest of Europe in our slipstream. Instead, what we want to do is chain ourselves. I think we could. What we want to do instead is chain ourselves to the back of the European Union, because we will get a worse deal than we had when we were there.
Oh, and we'd never go back in. And we'd never go back in. The British people wouldn't accept it.
I'll tell you what, even if we just had closer alignment with them, it would be bad. But either way, Europe is going to end up being dragged in America's slipstream, because that is its future. It has decided it doesn't want to be a live player. It doesn't want to be a big player on the world stage. It just wants to sit there. So America will drag it kicking and screaming in one direction, or China will in the other. It's up to it. And we will be behind them. That's the answer that Ed Davey's giving us.